Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 29th episode of Beyond Talking Points. And this is Matt, and I have my co-host Matt with me. So today we're going to have a discussion about positive and negative rights, and this has kind of been an underlying topic that's kind of been along a lot of things we've talked about the last 28 episodes. So I guess I'm going to give a brief overview. And if you've listened to this podcast in the past, you'd probably suspect that me and my co-host here have some disagreements to probably flesh out, or at least to push back on each other. So I'm going to end up giving some kind of like base objections and letting him, try to give a defense, and I'll see if it satisfies me. We'll go back and forth and have some fun, and that's how we plan on spending this episode. So just a brief overview, if you're not following if you haven't followed the general difference between positive and negative rights, or if you haven't heard it laid out in this way. So a negative right is your freedoms from things. So an example of this would be generally things like freedom of speech are thought of as government cannot infringe on your right to say certain things, or at least in certain settings, they can't crack down on your rights to say things. So you have the freedom from government in this situation to, pursue the speech you want to say. So nobody has an obligation to you. They just can't hurt you, right? They can't take that from you. So that would be like a negative right. A positive right, as an example that'll probably come up in this conversation, that comes up a lot in the mainstream political discourse, is like healthcare. And that's when people argue that people should have a positive right to healthcare, because people should have access to healthcare services if they're in need. And that kind of right would require somebody to, say, give you healthcare. So you do need somebody to intervene to provide you with it. But somebody could be claiming that doesn't mean we don't have a right to it. So generally, I stand by that they're really only negative rights. And if you've heard me talk, especially in I think recent weeks, I brought this up a few times. Since I only really believe in negative rights, I almost, to some extent, don't think rights exist. And that's also kind of a way to frame this conversation, because I think most of our rights are freedoms from government. So, and that's what a lot of what's in the Constitution is about. It's freedom from Congress, cracking down on your will to pursue your own religious interest, things like that. So these are all freedoms from another body. And I almost think, since my ideal doesn't have a government, these types of rights aren't real, because if we didn't have a government, you wouldn't have to have these rights from the government, right? So that's kind of another broad point I make, and that's kind of why I don't feel like I need to ground my rights in anything metaphysical or anything like that. But in the terms of this conversation, I really only believe in negative rights. So I think I've laid out those definitions, and I'll give you a second to, I guess, add anything on in the overview, and then maybe we'll transition into some objections I have. So go ahead.
The video that I linked to you, Tom Richley, something like that. He's like a history professor or history teacher, and he uploads, YouTube videos about history, politics, philosophy, stuff like that. But I bring him up because he mentioned like two key figures in American history that represent both views of rights. So on the one hand, you have Thomas Jefferson, who was a strong proponent in negative rights. Jefferson was all about, at least in theory, small government, and he, in his influence, in the situations where he had any influence at all, he was trying very hard to create a government which basically kept out of people's way, a government which allowed for certain basic things, but generally speaking, allowed people to do pretty much whatever they want. His whole phrase, people should have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's just kind of, in some sense, I almost feel like our country was founded more in the direction of negative rights, or more concerned with negative rights And then, fast forward to a couple hundred years, and you had the Great Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Um, Now, Roosevelt, he believed in certain negative rights, but he added on certain positive rights. So he said that the people have a right to be they have a right not to be fearful, not to be in state of fear all the time. And there was one other thing he said, which is slipping my mind, but basically, FDR would disagree with Jefferson in some respects, and my uh, my beliefs, my outlook are more aligned with FDR than Jefferson, and I say that because what FDR might say to Jefferson is, look, in order to have a life, in order to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of, in order to pursue happiness, life, and liberty, um, you have to have a few basic things met. So, you have to have a roof over your head. You have to have access to food and water. You have to have access to basic health care. And of course, in our economy, you have to have money. You have to have access to a job of some sort, which will get you money, which is the way we acquire goods and services. So when I'm having a conversation about rights, I think it's important to remember that we don't live in a bubble in which everyone can pretty much do whatever they want because everyone has the bare minimum. And I guess kind of what I wanted to, the goal of this conversation, I guess, if I had to pin it down to a phrase, I just want to know, do you acknowledge that maybe in either situation or in either framework, someone's rights are getting not taken away per se, but are maybe a bit neglected, or someone's getting someone is not getting something. So in a society which maybe theoretically was solely on believes solely in negative rights, the people who don't have basic things like healthcare and shelter, they would be the ones that suffer. But in a government, in a country there that believes wholly in positive rights, you could say, or the libertarian might say that, well, that means that they're, if I earn $500,000 a year, I'm going to have to pay for Joe Smith's healthcare because he can't afford it because he's a janitor. So it kind of goes back, I guess, to what you talk about often, which is trade-offs. And I guess I just kind of, before the end of this conversation, I want to see if you believe that there are trade-offs to both worldviews, or if you really think that one really fully encompasses what it means to be human and the society that we should construct.
So I have two thoughts. I guess I don't want to take your words super literally at the end, because so the most correct thing that I agree with in what you're saying there is that I think positive and negative rights have an incredibly vast tension. And that's one of the objections I kind of wanted to bring up, and I want to run by you, and I think that'll be a good springboard here. And I think I'll reconcile that to come around to, I guess, your broader conclusion, maybe closer to the end of the podcast. So one thing that seems apparent to me is the existence of really any positive rights ends up infringing on a lot of the basic negative rights that you'd hear any libertarian kind of argue for. So for example, I'm a big proponent of freedom of association and being able to contract with whoever you want for really any reason, as long as it's consensual agreement. So if you and I want to, make a trade, I think we have every right to do that, and I don't think anybody should be able to tell us we can't trade if the trade is only reflecting our property, you and I, and it has no other involved parties. I don't see why anybody should be able to tell us not to. And I would say that is like a negative right we possess, is that we should be able to have this consensual agreement if we both agree, free from outside forces. Now, I think pretty much the positive rights that are typically pointed to would invalidate freedom of association, because unless there's a willing participant in it, then you don't have the freedom to associate. So I guess an example of this would be like that. It would be back to the healthcare one. If you're saying healthcare is a positive right that everyone has, well, you're either requiring that people are there to consensually give them healthcare, in which case you don't really need healthcare as a positive right because you already have freedom of association, or you say there isn't people who are willing to give them healthcare consensually. So you're going to, I guess, kind of force a healthcare apparatus to exist that will be able to give them healthcare, and you're going to bring that into existence through other means, which is typically by confiscating money and creating a government institution, right? So it wouldn't happen naturally if there was no third-party government, because or else you wouldn't need this positive right. So you're violating freedom of association because to get to that government apparatus, you have to say tax a bunch of people or something of the sort. So I think by redistributing these resources, you're going from having this positive right to infringing on the negative right. I think these rights are always going to be, the positive and negative rights are going to be contrasting, because if people freely associated, you wouldn't need that positive right to fulfill the need, if that makes sense. So maybe I think you could push back on the healthcare example, maybe, but in general, the way that these two forces, I guess, these kinds of rights interact, do you think I'm onto something? How do you kind of respond to that?
I think that the general ANCAP or libertarian argument, I think that they often miss something, and that something is this. If people can get away with it, they'll take shortcuts and they'll be lazy, and they will even if they don't have to help somebody, for example, that there's a possibility that they won't, and so you could say, like, when it comes to this healthcare debate, like, oh, the free market will take care of everything. Everyone will have healthcare due to the free market, and I'm not saying you're saying that necessarily, but I've heard people make that argument. But I don't think that freedom of association, as you call it, is going to lead to the healthcare outcomes which I think every civilized society should have.
Okay, I think I need to rephrase what I was saying, because I don't think what you said was necessarily wrong, but I feel like you took what I was saying and pulled it in a different direction, right? So I'm pretty much saying I don't expect freedom of association to give everybody everything, right? Because if for people to interact with each other, generally there's something in it for them, right? So if there was a free market, people usually pay to get healthcare. Now, there'd be a lot of people doing pro bono work. There'd be a lot of people donating, and all that could happen freely too. But I'm not telling, and I think I admitted this the other episode, it's like I would expect in really any system people to fall between the cracks. So like I'm the first to cede that. Now, I guess what I'm not really asking you to say, well, I'm willing to make that. I'm not asking you to say that you're willing to make that trade off. I'm more asking you, aren't these positive and negative rights always going to have tension? Because you're saying freedom of association doesn't fix the healthcare problem, which is why we have to give them the positive rights. So I guess what I'm saying is, did you agree that positive and negative rights can't really coexist because the positive rights trample on the negative rights? Or you could put it in the nice way to, I guess, your side, because you're more pro positive rights, but you could say the negative rights trample on the positive rights. But either way, we're admitting that these things can't really coexist. To some extent, it has to be one or the other, or else you end up infringing on, I guess, both to a lesser extent, right? But if we're talking about in the abstract, you can't really have a right to both because one of them is going to be infringed upon. I think that's more what I was getting at. I wasn't really asking you to kind of say if you thought it was preferable of a system. I was more saying this meta point about rights.
I mean, in some sense, I'm willing to split the difference with you. I mean, I'm not sure. I think it often depends on which rights we're talking about. Um, I don't think that all negative and positive rights contradict each other, and I think you can have some of both. But are there some positive rights that negate some negative rights, and some negative rights that negate some positive rights? Yeah, I mean, I think that's uncontroversially true, and I guess that's kind of the point that maybe you've even already conceded it. That's kind of the point that I really want to think about in this podcast. I want us to acknowledge first and foremost that kind of something I mentioned the other day, which is any system you have, people are going to fall through the cracks, and so I think it'll make the conversation much more honest if maybe we can both come to an agreement that that both negative and positive rights come with benefits and with costs.
Okay, so I think I have a couple points to make, and then I think I want to explain why maybe pursuing that route is going to be less fruitful than just some interrogative questions I have about positive rights, because maybe there's clarification to be gained on my end from hearing your thoughts. But I think what I would say is there are pretty clearly trade-offs to one or the other, because if you're talking about a lot of positive rights are kind of well, you're talking about pushing the baseline up, so they end up being like you're going to distribute things in different ways, and that's going to benefit certain people, it's going to hurt certain people, it's going to tax certain people, it's going to give things to other people. And yeah, that's inherently a trade-off that some could say is worth it and some isn't. Now, I would jump to the kind of what we were talking about last week and say, but I think certain hierarchies, just like values, I think these certain ones are valid, right? So I think negative rights are fine because they come from the individual. The individual is making these choices. And I think positive rights are forced onto people. And I'm not okay with force. And I think force is illegitimate. And I think it's wrong, right? So, and we disagree on that. And that's why I don't think that's going to be as fruitful of a thing to pursue. So I can acknowledge there's trade-offs, but I also do think there's a reason why negative rights are more legitimate to me than positive rights. And that's why I have a lot of questions about positive rights, because positive rights don't strike me as, I guess, intrinsically valid. They're really based on kind of the outcome to me, and the outcome doesn't really validate it. It doesn't validate violating freedom of association and certain things that have the locus of the individual. So did you want to double down on that road, or should I pursue some other, I guess, interesting questions I have that are about positive rights?
I guess I'll just say something really quickly, and then you can, start peppering me with questions on positive rights if you wish. So, I mean, I guess right off the bat, I think we are then agreeing to a certain extent, at least, which I'm pleased about. And I guess I would just say that I don't see the value, or rather, I think this idea of free association that you talk about often, I think that comes at a cost, and that's the kind of cost that I would be trying to avoid if I were, dictator of the world.
Okay, I'm fine. I'm fine with leaving that part there. Okay, so here's a few things when just thinking about positive rights that kind of sprung to my mind, and I was just curious how you'd reconcile it, because I feel like you probably thought about this more than I have, or presumably thought about it more than I have. Okay, so one thing I was thinking about is a lot of positive rights I hear are very aspirational things, and they're very normative things. So I listen to Pod Save America sometimes because I'm a masochist, right? I want to listen to the Bernie Bros, the former Obama staffers, and I want to hear them throw out a litany of progressive things that I hate everything that they say, and they don't even back it up because they don't care. Because if you're listening to it, you usually agree. So it's just a load of assertions. So they will call anything a right if it's positive. And to some extent, if it's not going to be implemented in the law of force, why not call it a right? It rallies people up, it hypes them up, and it makes it feel like you're valid for thinking everybody needs it. But in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, these are a lot of things that everybody agrees it would be good to have, but they're just saying it's a right, and it's just an assertion. So I guess what I was coming to what is like the limiting principle on when a normative thought is a right versus isn't, and how arbitrary is this? Because like off the top of my head, I came up with like a right to education, a right to healthcare, a right to food, a right to employment, a right to safety, a right to mental wellness, a right to financial security in the long term. So I came up with all those things because they're things that are aspirational and are normative, and I don't see why all of them shouldn't just be rights, because they're all good and they're all things that are, I guess, we ought to have. So would you say that all those things should be positive rights, or do you have like a limiting principle, I guess, on when things should and shouldn't be positive rights?
So when I'm considering the question of rights, I'm most concerned with what are the conditions that people need in order to um, thrive, in order to um, enjoy life to a certain extent. Um, and you know, I actually don't have a problem in that list you just gave. I think I would probably say that yes, all of those are rights, and we can maybe bicker on the nature of uh, what the words you said exactly mean and what that exactly means in the broader scheme of things. But you know, um, we and this is almost where I'm gonna like maybe upset some animal rights activists, but like humans are very like unique beings. There's really, as far as we know, nothing quite like us. Um, and this kind of goes back to another conversation we had before. Like I believe in something such as human nature. I think humans are kind of built a certain way. I think they have certain predispositions, and I think um, the kind of society that I want to that I envision, the kind of society that I want to um, that I want to head towards is the kind of society where people um, are able to um, have the basic needs taken care of, as well as having other things which aren't quite basic needs, but which are necessary um, if you want a certain end goal. So I think someone should have the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health care. Just because if you don't have that stuff, you die. Okay, but then it's like, okay, but is education a right? And I would say, yes, it is, because the educated person is far more free, if you'll forgive the term, than an uneducated person. You need a certain level of um, you need a certain level of education in order to sort of know something about the world around you, to know to know more about yourself, to know about what kind of things you might want to do with your life. Do you want um, what kind of life do you want to lead? What kind of person do you want to be? So and it doesn't bother me. I know you don't like rights in the sense that like you're not a religious person, so it's like you're skeptical of the metaphysics of it, if you will. Um, but I'm not very concerned with the metaphysics of rights. And I'll tell you, I guess, why that is. I'm also not religious. I don't believe that a God created us with certain rights. But I do believe that because human beings um, exist, and because human beings have a certain nature to them, I think that means that would logically um, logically lead us to should logically lead us to interact with other humans in a certain way. And so, yeah, just to summarize, what I consider rights are the things which allow people to express themselves and live life to the fullest extent that they're able to. Someone in a third world country doesn't have the kind of freedoms that you and I have, and I would go so far as to say that that due to certain things, due to whether it's their corrupt government or geopolitics or what have you, they have been deprived of certain things that you and I have. But I want to see a world where everybody has what you and I have in that basic sense. Doesn't mean everyone has to be a millionaire. Doesn't mean everything is a right, but it does mean that, as far as I'm concerned, certain things have to be taken care of before I can say that society is just or is worthwhile or is worth living in.
Okay. Uh, in in a in a moment of, I guess, podcast self-awareness, I think I want to say that I'm kind of intrigued in like certain parts of positive rights in terms of how you'll defend it. But that doesn't mean that every time I ask you a question, you have to turn it into a litigation of the base conversation of negative versus positive rights, because I'm more curious about some nuances. So I do appreciate what you said at the end and how you tied that into the broad theme, but I don't think that's necessary if I'm going to keep grilling you on questions. So I do want to throw that out there just to be aware so we don't get too redundant. But I do acknowledge how that's part of the broader point. Now, when we're focusing specifically on things like, okay, so broadly, you're okay with these things that you think are necessary for some sort of level of involvement in the society. So you can make the case that that's food, shelter, and even education, and then jobs and things like this. So I guess when I say when I ask what is the limiting principle, it also on a very specific level for each of these things, I think you also need some sort of limiting principle, because you don't just say, somebody's entitled to food, but it's also like, well, sometimes food is, a very expensive meal that I could not afford. It's filet mignon or something like that, or it's a nice, it's something that's not McDonald's, right? So when you say people have a right to food, it's like, okay, well, to what food, right? Are they entitled to anything that they can get their hands on, or are they entitled to like the basic level of sustenance, right? Do they have to eat certain things that are nutritious, or can they eat whatever processed junk that they are willing to buy? And then I think a better example is when it comes to things like jobs, and when it comes to things like the minimum wage, right, where people say everybody should have the right to make a certain level of money per hour. Well, if you live in a certain county in a state, the living wage to like be able to live in like a one bedroom apartment and feed yourself could be $10 an hour, and in another county it could be $23 an hour. So you can have these vastly different, I guess, standard of livings in areas, but nationally, the stance of like Bernie Sanders is that $15 minimum wage is what is necessary for people to have like a honest living. And it seems to some extent kind of arbitrary, right? So well, I guess what I'm saying is a lot of these things sound aspirational, but it doesn't answer the question to what extent. Like, to what extent does somebody have a right to healthcare? If somebody has like needs a treatment that would cost millions of dollars, do they have a right to that? Because it's infinitely more expensive than, say, doing things that would save thousands and thousands of lives for people in Africa involved with like malaria, right? So you need some kind of limiting principle to a lot of these things because there is scarcity. You can't say people have an unlimited right to healthcare, because if there's some very rare treatment that only a top surgeon can deliver, he can't deliver that to everybody who needs it. He can only deliver it to a small number. So I guess when you see this happen in the market, things get allocated based on price, or they get allocated based on who can get to who, based on referrals or based on other status that people end up figuring out amongst themselves. But I get worried because positive rights talk about government, and then they don't usually acknowledge how they're going to deal with about how they end up bottoming out with scarcity. And then you end up with like, I don't know if you remember Charlie Gard in the UK a few years ago, but that was the case where the infant was pretty much on life support. And there was a couple of surgeries that the people in that country, and I don't think the NHS wanted to do it, So a panel pretty much sentenced the little infant that had just been born to death because they didn't want to give it treatment and they didn't want to keep it on life support, right? So it's like, to what extent do people have rights to these things, even if you're saying they have a positive right to them? How do you work with those kinds of questions?
I mean, I'm less concerned. You can give like specific examples where you can say, well, this person needs this $1 million treatment, or they're gonna die. Haha, that can't be a right then because it's so expensive. I'm not. I don't mean to be flippant about your argument, but that's not really my concern so much. I mean, okay. Let me put it this way. Like, I know why you're asking that, and that's a fair question. But like at some level, that's almost a question for the future, because at the moment we have we don't even have the bare essentials. So people don't even have the right to the bare essentials, the things they just need to be alive. And I suppose I'm less concerned about finding the finding the perfect like philosophical justification for this in the moment, when I'm more concerned with bettering the material conditions of people living in the here and now. So I like that. That is definitely something we have to think about, but I don't think that necessarily invalidates my point in the sense that we're not even at that bare minimum yet. Now, of course, when it comes to something like healthcare, I mean, technically, we already have free healthcare or we already have universal healthcare in the sense that doctors don't turn you away unless they're like a really special, expensive doctor. But if you go to the ER and you're dying of a gunshot wound, they're going to treat you. You could go bankrupt from the medical bills. We don't care about that, but they're going to treat you. So, like, I just want to get to a point where everybody is able to live in this society and not die from things that are so easily preventable, not have to be homeless, not have to starve to death, not have to die because they don't have access to health care. That is my main concern. And only afterwards do we have to start ironing out, okay, how much of healthcare does someone have a right to, or how much food does someone have a right to? I think that squares that circle for me.
Okay, I have like two more, I guess, general positive rights questions, and then maybe we can summarize, maybe push back on more things, but I do want to get to these. Okay, so another one I have is, it's kind of about positive rights potentially contradicting each other because of the way the government handles it. So I guess an example is, I know everybody's talking about like you have the right to like a living wage, but also I threw out like the right to financial security. And this is how everybody gets mad at late stage capitalism, because there's a recession like every 10 years. And, I chalk that up to the Federal Reserve. And I chalk that up to how we incentivize people to borrow money when they shouldn't borrow money with artificially low interest rates. Then those companies have loans that come to roost, and they didn't end up using their resources effectively because they got money too cheap. And then all of a sudden, when they reflect on their asset status, they realize they're having a bad time, right? When their debt gets more expensive after they borrowed it initially at a really low rate. So this is something that happens regularly, and it is well-intentioned policy, right? The idea is we have growth when times seem bad, so we give people cheap money, but it ends up having this huge negative consequence because assets are allocated poorly, and it leads to crashes. So to some extent, I guess I would say I could see somebody arguing that something like the Federal Reserve should exist because people should have rights to a job. And something that incentivizes job creation is cheap money. But then that same thing will later cause, say, like a crash. So in my mind, like the right to, I guess, financial security, right? So the economy not crashing every 10 years would be in conflict with the way that the government tries to incentivize jobs for everybody to have. Another way to look at this would be like home ownership. The government has the Department of Urban Housing Development because they want people to be homeowners. So they incentivize these loans that are pretty bad for banks to take on. But then those banks take on those loans because the government backs them. But then what ends up happening is other things financially get based on those loans. And then when they go under, it hurts other people in a separate sector. So in the attempt to, say benefit home ownership, you end up hurting other people because that's the way that interfering with the market has it. So I guess the easy answer is to say, well, if you make everything public property or something like that, you abolish markets, then you don't have to worry about that because all these things end up being because of government market interplay. And if the government can perfectly centrally plan everything because there are no markets, then maybe that'd be the way around it. But if that's not going to be the case anytime soon, I guess how do you kind of reconcile that one pursuit of one positive right can either make things worse for a bunch of other people who are unrelated, or it can even end up backfiring? Because that's something that I see in public policy rather often, is policies end up initially working or being perceived to work, but then they hurt the people they're intended to help. And this is one of the reasons why, before I was more of a libertarian, I turned kind of right wing because I saw a lot of policies backfiring. So I guess how do you reconcile that, or I guess do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess the simple answer would be that I don't think that our current government is pursuing pursuing the right ends, or in other words, I don't think that the government is really concerned with getting the American people to the bare level of living. So I'm not in any. I don't need to. I don't need to defend. The government singling out homeowners and saying, I want everyone to own a home, or I don't have to defend the Federal Reserve in the sense that I don't think that my vision of positive rights, or the ones that are worth pursuing, I don't think are being implemented. But as to whether certain positive rights, just in general, contradict other positive rights, that's another philosophical conversation that we have to have at some point. But when it comes to what is necessary for life, I don't see the contradiction in those specific positive rights. So if everyone has a roof over their head, if everyone has access to food, if everyone has access to water and healthcare, and if everyone has access to jobs, we can debate the specific details, but maybe you would want to flesh this out for me. I'm just not seeing the contradiction in those basic rights. It depends on when we're getting into some more maybe higher level rights, or rights that we consider after we've taken care of the bare essentials, that perhaps there are more trade-offs, and there are more contradictions among them.
Well, I guess to kind of flesh out some examples is, I guess you could think of a lot of subsidies will benefit certain, jobs. And if you think people have rights to certain types of jobs, then the government will do things to incentivize those, or they'll do things to incentivize job creation as a whole. So I guess this is why I was trying to pit the idea of everybody having access to a job versus, say, financial security. So right now, like, our government does give the Federal Reserve a couple mandates, where the Federal Reserve is supposed to do things that will specifically lower unemployment and target inflation at a given rate depending on the year. Those are like the two main mandates of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve should be targeting low inflation, but in doing so, they risk our future financial security. So these are two things that, like, ideally I would think in like the litany of rights that we could have, which is like food, shelter, access to water, access to a good job. I would think, like, any kind of long-term financial security would be on that list. And in the pursuit of, expanding the job pool, they're putting us at financial risk 10 years from now. I guess something similar could be said about, say, Social Security, where to want to give people a good retirement now, we are creating a giant asset that is underfunded, right? So in the idea of creating Social Security as a program, but then simultaneously keeping wages up by not taxing people more, we haven't taxed enough to justify how much we pay out with Social Security, so that program will go insolvent at some point. So, like, in the pursuit of trying to give people this long-term retirement, we've created this huge debt crisis that everybody else is going to have to live with, and it's going to create huge financial problems in the future, right? And even though so there are some people who think we can inflate our way out of debt, that will still inflate the currency, and that's a hidden cost on everybody who has any currency or savings or assets, right? So there are all these trade-offs for for these big financial interventions that are to keep people secure, keep them in jobs. So I feel those ones are directly in conflict. I know that doesn't have to do with, say, food or necessarily like having a house, but these are very similar positive rights that I would probably think, if I was a believer in positive rights, these are things that would be normative to me. But I think that they end up contrasting each other and putting each other at risk. So I kind of think, well, how can these things both be rights if they're actively, pushing up against each other?
I mean, I hope I'm not contradicting myself, but I'm in the position in this conversation where what I hear you saying is not what I think you're saying. And what I mean is, I hear you attacking specific government agencies or government policies. So you're saying Social Security is going to become insolvent pretty soon, and you're saying that the Federal Reserve it creates unemployment and fights inflation, but it's going to lead to a crash in the next 10 years. But I guess my response to that is I chalk that up with to the incompetence of the government, and I don't chalk that up to a philosophical contradiction between certain positive rights. Like, take a job, take the right to work, for example. I don't think, or I would not say, that people have a right to a specific kind of work, in the sense that certain jobs require certain things. Certain jobs require you to, get a certain level of education or go through certain training. And if you're a high school dropout and you want to become a doctor, I'm not going to say you have the right to become a doctor. Now we can disagree or agree or debate on how effective these licensing agencies are for doctors in general. But point being, if you're not going to put in the effort to get a good medical education, then you don't have a right to become a doctor. But if you want to pursue the necessary, if you want to take the necessary steps to become a doctor, then yeah, you have the right to be a doctor. And then, about when it comes to the insolvency of Social Security, I mean, I won't go too deeply into that, but I think you and I both know that the way the government handles its budget is atrocious, and that there are ways that we could make up for the differences in Social Security if we decreased the money that we use in one particular government agency and increase it in another government agency. But we don't do that for various reasons. So again, I don't see this as a philosophical contradiction of certain positive rights. I see you as attacking government corruption and incompetence, which I would probably agree with you about at the end of the day.
So I think that brings up a couple things for me. So I think the reason why those examples seem most relevant is because in my mind, the government specifically said we want more people to have jobs. So we are going to mandate an agency to do X, right? So I'm not really asking you to defend that. I was more thinking like, okay, well, here's a clear time where even though they don't say people have a right to a job, they are acting in a way to limit unemployment to a very like low level, ideally. That's what they're aiming for. That's what they're telling the Federal Reserve to do. So even though they aren't outright stating we believe American people have a positive right to a job, they are saying, hey, Federal Reserve, expand money to get unemployment to this level, right? So even though they're not saying it out loud, in practice, they're acting in that way. So it's an example in my mind of a positive right being applied to how it actually would work in the real modern world. And that's kind of why I'm like, well, I see unintended consequences. Now, I don't think we want to dwell on that because, as you mentioned, I'm not attacking it philosophically. But I think one of the reasons I'm not attacking it philosophically is I think that we're finding that to some extent, positive rights are grounded in a very subjective way because you're defining it kind of as like the baseline of what somebody needs, right? And I've kind of asked about limiting principles or what normative things would count because I don't think that's really an objective standard. You can say people have a right to food, but then it's like, okay, well, there is a unlimited variety of food. You're just saying like they have access, they should have a right to a certain amount of sustenance. But then I would think, okay, well, from whom? Well, what kinds of food? It's not as simple as what I think negative rights are. When I think of negative rights, I think of, well, these are things that originate from the individual and you're acting on your own voluntary nature and it all comes from you. You own the rights to your own labor and you own the rights to your property and you can choose who you associate with. All of that is very grounded because it's all grounded in who will work with you consensually, which is much different than say, um, which is much different than saying people have rights in education and then thinking, okay, well, what kind of education? Do they need college? Should people have free access to PhDs, even though they could get a job with a bachelor's degree? Should people have free access to a bachelor's degree, even if they can get a good job with a high school degree in some places? Is it good enough access because everybody has a phone, which gives you access to unlimited information on the internet? Or should we give people phones because phones have unlimited access to the internet, which has unlimited education? So, like, that's why I almost think a lot of positive rights aren't philosophical. They're kind of subjective, and every nuanced detail of them comes down to a subjective evaluation that is really grounded in just preference. But I think the negative rights are very objective. And I think that that's why I'm so hesitant to adopt positive rights. So I know you're egging to saying a lot about that. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so I think, I mean, there's so many different angles to your statement. Um, you know, when I say that someone has a right to food, what I mean is somebody has a right to all the necessary nutrients that go into making a physically and psychologically healthy individual. Um, now you can't force someone at gunpoint to eat vegetables. If they don't want to eat vegetables, I'm not saying that the firing squad's going to come to your house and make you eat broccoli. But what I am saying is people should have access to the necessary nutrients, and people shouldn't have to live on, McDonald's all the time, just because it's cheap and just because they can't or they're struggling to afford healthy alternatives. Now, as for the question of how subjective or objective this conversation is, I guess I might need a little more fleshing out in your part. So, I mean, I see it as objective in the sense that, going back to my previous examples. To be a human being means you need certain things so you don't die. And again, you seem to be getting to the edges of the conversation, and you're saying, well, what level of education do people need? What kind of food do people need, or do people have the right to? What kind of education do people have the right to? And I think it's objective in the sense that people do need certain things in order to have a certain standard of living, and I think that to I think that most people, if they could have access to healthcare and education, if they, there's a reason that, the United States is like one of the most liked and the most hated countries around the world. And I think part of that is, at some level, a lot of people want to be like us. Now, again, I'm not saying we're perfect. Obviously, we're not perfect. And in certain instances, you could say the government acts like we have certain positive rights. In other instances, they don't. Healthcare, they don't act like we have a positive right in that respect. But, Sam Harris once said in some podcast he was on that, you can, it might have been one of the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debates. He said, you can not know what you're missing. And I think that's a good way to look at it. I think most people, or probably the majority, if they could get a nice education, if they could get healthcare regularly, if they could have a job, if they could, never have to worry about going hungry, they would. And so I don't quite understand why you're saying that is a subjective interpretation of humanity when most people yearn to have a life as privileged, if you'll forgive the term, as yours is and mine is. Most people don't want to live in a hut all day, facing a scorching sun and having to walk 2 miles to get a, a bucket of water, which half of it will evaporate by the time you're back to your hut. Most people don't want to live that life, and that is why I would say that this is actually more my vision of positive rights is more objective than you're letting on.
So I think one of my main critiques, I guess a more maybe academic way of phrasing it would be that the things you're arguing for aren't very universal. They're not universalizable, right? So in general, you can say people have hunger, but when you're talking about, say, people's diets, it varies completely based on, I guess, culture and the thing that's most important is what is truly available, right? When we're talking about scarcity. So if you're at a place where you can only eat certain types of food, then those people would presumably only be getting certain types of food unless you could import it. So what I guess I'm saying is you can say broadly people should have a right to food. And it's like, okay, I'm fine with that as a normative statement. You can say that's what people should have. But I guess I don't think you can universalize that as a rule, but you can universalize something as you have the rights to your own labor and to reap the benefits of, what you're able to trade your labor for. And then the things that you've now acquired from your labor, which your labor was intrinsic to you, you can now use to go get other things, right? And all these things stem from you and your labor. But then when you start talking about things like education or healthcare, it's like, okay, well, all of these things are completely different based on the individual, and all of them have 500, sub definitions, right? So you can get healthcare because you're going to die, and you can get healthcare because you have a limp. You can have healthcare because your leg just hurts for a couple weeks. You don't even have a limp, but it just hurts, right? So there are these varying degrees of things like healthcare, and then there are varying degrees in a similar way to education, right? So, you could say people should at least get through 8th grade. because then you have like some level of basic introduction to a lot of things. And, you know, honestly, when it comes to a lot of minimum wage jobs, I don't know if you even need to understand more than like an eighth grade education, because some of them are very, very simple, or they don't really use that. But for some jobs, you need to get a PhD. But some people would want to pursue a PhD and some people wouldn't. Maybe more people pursue a bachelor's degree if you could have everything accessible. I'm not discounting that. I guess what I'm saying is when you talk about rights and you're using broad words like education, that or healthcare that have so many subcategories that it's just hard for me to distinguish what is, I guess, particularly valid or universalizable. And then that's before we even talk about, say, scarcity. And I think scarcity is easier to imagine. I know you like bringing it back to the United States, but I don't know why our conversation is confined to the United States. Why don't we talk about why don't we talk about countries that are more impoverished and why they don't have positive rights? And the reason why you'd probably say they don't have positive rights is because it's hard to get to that floor. It's hard to get to the floor in a place where there aren't even enough huts for the people that live there. So it's like, well, how can you say you have a positive right to housing if you can't get housing because there aren't enough houses? So it's like, well, that right can't exist if there isn't stuff for you to get to, right? So if you're on a desert island, right, you can't have positive rights because there's none of the stuff that you think you need exist. If it was year zero, or well, not year zero, but like, 20,000 BC, and you're in the middle of nowhere, you could say you have a right to healthcare because everybody should have a right to healthcare, but you can't exercise that right because there's nobody there to come and give you it. But what I'm saying is, well, you can reap the benefits, the rewards, and the rewards of your own labor. So if somebody finds themselves in the middle of nowhere and then nobody has laid a property claim to the property you're on, then you can look around and you can make yourself something. And then once you're willing to defend it, you have a property claim on it, right? And everything you've done has been from your own labor, and everything you've gotten, everything you've acquired has been an extension of that. And then if you go and trade it, that's an extension of that. So that's why I see these negative rights very grounded, and the positive rights are more aspirational. And this kind of, I'm not saying that what you're arguing for isn't intuitive, especially in the Western world. I just don't think it's philosophically universal in the same way that, say, the rights to your own labor is. And that's why I kind of push back on it as a right. And that's why I think negative rights are more valid than positive rights. And I understand the case for positive rights and why it's an aspirational goal, and I'm not discounting that. I would mostly criticize it for policy reasons and why I think a lot of those policies end up backfiring. I just think they're almost completely different, and for the reasons I just kind of laid out.
Okay, so like when you say culture, like I guess I'll push back on this idea that my idea of positive rights can't be universalizable. So cultures eat different food. How can we universalize the right to food? And that's not really. I don't see that as a contradiction of my point.
I feel like I'm being mischaracterized right now.
Well, but can I finish?
Yeah, go ahead. I just want to say that based on how you're starting, I feel like I'm being mischaracterized.
Well, let me think of another way of putting it. Okay, so you would say, let me steelman your argument in the hopes of getting it right. So what I hear you saying is, to the negative rights come from the individual, based on certain things that are tangible, that are universalizable, such as the right to your own labor. And positive rights are kind of almost utopian, or not utopian, but like idealistic, or you said aspirational, and that due to the subjective differences among people, among cultures, among individuals, you can't quite say certain things are rights. And not only that, but there are so many different aspects to things like healthcare and education that you have to pin down which part of healthcare or education you are saying is a right. Is that a good characterization of your position? Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with you continuing on based on that. Yeah.
Okay. So, I was going to use the food example because I think it's a simple example. Just because different cultures eat somewhat differently, or vastly differently for that matter, that doesn't mean uh, that I don't think I don't see how that's not universalizable in the sense that people can people can there's a lot of food out there, a lot of different kinds of fruits and vegetables and meat, and you can prepare it in vastly different ways. And there are so many different meals that you can create. And all I'm saying is, when it in terms of the right to nutrients, the right to food, it is that people should have enough access to all the types of food that you need to have that have all the vitamins and minerals and protein that you need in order to live a happy, healthy life. But I don't see why cultures eating different food really invalidates that, unless we assume that certain cultures just eat nothing but garbage, which is not really the case. I mean, you could say that Americans don't eat very well, but most Americans don't eat McDonald's all the time. A lot of people cook their own food. So I'm saying people should have the right to the access to all the necessary food groups. That doesn't. That's my point.
So I think a better way to maybe be more productive is I guess I was making 2 points, and they're related points that interact with each other, so that I think they have to both be taken at once. So the first one is, if you're in 20,000 BC in the middle of nowhere and there's not another person in sight, I think the negative rights I'm talking about are somewhat, I guess, actionable, right? Because you still have the right to your own labor, and you still have the right to benefit from your own labor. You can hunt something, you can stake out your own little grounds, and you've done this. But then you don't have your right to healthcare and your right to housing can't really be actualized because there's nobody there to provide it for you. So that's like point one. And then point two, and I think that's a very objective point, because everybody who does work can think about their own labor and their own inputs, and then how they have been reciprocated for those inputs. And in more primitive times, that's hunting and actually, killing an animal and so you can eat it. But now it's, so I sit at a desk and I input things and I get money, and then I buy a dumb movie poster because I wanted it, right? So even though those are me buying different things or eating different things, it's still universal. It's universalized because it comes down to that like core thing that is existent even like as long as humanity has existed. But then when we're talking about positive rights, they're almost so you can broaden out to say, well, I'm just talking about a right to food and a right to education. But I guess food could be a bad example, but I don't think it's the worst example. But I guess I don't really want to dwell on it, because then it gets overly nuanced about what kinds of foods are available or what kind of diets people prefer. But I guess what I'm saying is, when we talk about, say, like a right to an education, thinking about what education level is and how it's delivered to you and what education really means to you as a person. And if we're talking about formalized or informal, and if we're talking about different fields and how much knowledge people should have a right to on different fields and to what fields that should extend to, and then how you go about obtaining that knowledge, if you think we should learn even more about certain things, I feel like all those things show that it's not as objective and rooted. It's very subjective based on what we're just kind of thinking is good and what we want for society. So I'm not saying that's like not an invalid way of thinking about things. I'm just saying it feels odd to claim it's some kind of right when these other rights feel much more valid because they're intrinsic to humanity as a whole. And then this one is just, I understand the point of it's a baseline we want, but it's still depending on 2020 versus 1990, the idea of a right to an education would probably mean very different things. So it's not universalized in the same way. And I wouldn't really say somebody in negative, in 20,000 BC really wants or cares about a right to education, because that's really just if they could figure out how to plant something or hunt something, but there's nobody there to tell them anyways, in my example. So I guess that's what I'm saying. Here's where I think these things are different, and this is why I think one is legitimate in a more abstract philosophical way, and that's why I'm willing to defend one instead of the other, which could still be noble, but I don't think it's as, I guess, valid as a philosophical point. Or at best, I guess I'd say it's completely different.
I feel like you're making this like making the issue of positive rights a bit more complicated than it has to be. But let me put that aside for 1 second. I want to address that's actually a very interesting thought experiment you just gave me. But here's how I interpret that, or here's the way that I kind of think about it. So if a caveman in 200,000 BC or whatever you said, decides that a piece of land, he's going to live in a piece of land, or no, let's say there's a cave. He finds a cave. He decides, I'm going to live in this cave. He hunts every now and, or every day or every other day as much as he needs to get the food. He finds a way to store the necessary food, and maybe he'll grow some vegetables or plants on his land to eat as well. And what I hear you saying, again, to try to steelman your point, is it kind of makes sense even back then to say that person has a right to be left alone, that they should be able to do what they're doing, have a little piece of land, a little, like a cave to live in, food to eat, land to even grow some crops on, and that it just makes sense philosophically and also just commonsensically to not bother that person. But I guess what I would say to that is, if you're a caveman in 200,000 BC, another caveman comes along and thinks to himself, I want that piece of land. I want that cave. Sorry, I hit a button. What I was trying to say is, if another caveman comes along and thinks to himself, I want that cave. I want the food he's stored in his cave. I want the land to grow those crops on. He can just go over to that land, that caveman, and fight him. And if he wins that fight, he gets that land. So I'm not sure I follow your thought experiment in the sense that.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I totally know what I'm gonna say though. Okay, you can wrap it up if you want.
Okay, let me just finish.
Because I was thinking about that, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay. Well, let me just finish articulating it, then I'll let you respond. There's nothing stopping one caveman from, bonking the other caveman on top of the head till he's unconscious, dragging him to, 50 miles away or 50 yards away or whatever, and then going and defending that land for himself. So, the concept of rights really breaks down in terms of, even back then, because there were no rights. It was just people, and people at that point, they were a bit different than the people today, and so I don't think you can say, I don't think you can go back in time and say that in that context that a caveman has a right. I just don't think that makes sense. I think a right is something that really comes along from having a certain existing in a certain sphere,
Okay.
having a certain kind of consciousness And at that point, a caveman is just like a rabbit or a tiger. And we don't normally say, we don't, tigers don't go around thinking, I better not, kill that gazelle over there. I don't know if tigers actually eat gazelles, but I better not kill that animal over there because that animal has intrinsic rights. It's, I'm hungry. I need sustenance.
I need clarification now.
I'm going to eat I'm going to eat that antelope and go on my way.
Okay, now I need clarification because the way you wrap that up. Because I had a response, but then you kind of went on a separate tangent, and now I need to figure out which one's your argument. So is your argument that cavemen were so like subhuman, I guess, in their low IQ that they're almost animals, or what? Or was it the guy got attacked and that guy took his stuff? So how can rights be real? Because I have an answer to the second one, but the first one, if your argument is cavemen are pretty much animals, then I would say, okay, well then let's just substitute the example with you're in the middle of nowhere and you've appeared, right? So then it's just more of a thought experiment because I can't use time. But then I would say, well, imagine the caveman has 100 IQ. Because if we're talking about intelligent cavemen, I can defend it. If you're going to call them animals, though, and we kind of aren't having the argument about animal rights, then like that, then that kind of destroys everything.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, just to tie this loop, and then you can, we'll go from there. What I'm saying is, you've probably heard of this field of philosophy called ontology, and if you haven't, I don't remember what the Greek word is, but it just means the study of being. And cavemen don't exist in the same way that you and I exist.
Okay, and, I got enough to respond.
That is why. That is one reason I would say they don't have rights in that sense. But then and in the other sense, it's just that nothing's preventing one caveman from beating up another caveman and taking his stuff. And at some level, when it comes to rights, even if it's negative rights, you have to have some enforcing mechanism involved. Doesn't have to be a government, but it has to be some way to enforce those rights, negative or positive. And in that context, there is no way to enforce that. And at that point, it is just survival of the fittest, as Herbert Spencer characterized Darwinism.
Okay, so I appreciate that you clarified. You got me bursting at the seams by not answering me in like a sentence. You said like 8, so I'm sitting here just like ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to completely sidestep the whole thing about caveman IQ because I think my point stands whether we're talking about cavemen or just a hypothetical 115 IQ person in the same scenario that somehow ended up 30,000 years BC in a plane with nothing there. And then another person approaches them and says, oh, this dude built up a whole little farm. I'm just going to kill him and take his stuff. So you're saying rights need an enforcement mechanism. I don't think there's any evidence that that is true. And I think if you think that is true, it invalidates everything about positive rights because there's nothing enforcing them and people don't get it handed to them directly. So I think it's clear that if you think rights have to have been historically enforced, then we couldn't have had, then positive rights haven't existed. And then you're kind of arguing for something that we all know isn't a right because it's currently not guaranteed. So if that's the standard you want to use, that's fine. But I think it cuts against everything you've been trying to say. Now, I don't think that's a requirement, which is great because I don't think rights have anything to do with what you actually have. I think it has to do with the level of claim you have to something, right? So because the true reality of things is if somebody owns enough guns, they could probably kill me very easily. They could have somebody, there's artillery that could probably kill me very easily right now, whether it requires somebody to break down my door and come with guns and shoot me a dozen times, or if they just want to drop a bomb on me, or if they want to do something cool, like a different kind of explosive. All these things could kill me, but I don't think you would say that like I didn't have rights because they killed me, or you wouldn't think that you wouldn't think that there are certain things that are core to me, right? So just because my freedom from government, the government didn't adhere to it, that doesn't mean I shouldn't have that right. So I guess what I would say is the reason why negative rights are important is they inform what valid property claims are, right? So valid property claims are when I do something and, like, say I make a consensual agreement and then I get something because of it and I use my own labor. All of these things have come from myself and they're all very valid. And it follows that because all of this is rooted in me and as things I've done without violence, that I have the right to it. Now, just because I have the right to it doesn't mean that an unethical piece of garbage could shoot me in the head and take all my stuff. Having a right doesn't put a force field around me, and I'm the first one to acknowledge that. I just think that's a completely separate argument. And I would love if those rights were enforced, because then I wouldn't be taxed and I would be allowed to have any voluntary transaction I wanted without being worried about thrown in a cage. But we don't live in that world. And I think if you want to say every right needs an enforcement mechanism, then you'd have to say that in every society, probably known to man, there are no rights, because not all rights have been defended with, you know, with unequivocal force historically, or probably any time in the future either. So I just think the enforcement thing, although that was an intuition I also had when I was thinking this through, and I think it's a valid intuition, but I think it's very misguided. So I don't think that's really relevant. But I would say the real important point I'm trying to make, though, is the negative rights I'm talking about inform what kind of property claims are valid. So even though that guy could come and bonk me in the head and take my stuff, and I haven't put a force field around me, it does say he's clearly wrong for doing it because everything has come from my labor and then he has stolen it from me, which is evil, right? He has infringed on my rights because he's an evil person, right? So I have had I've validly acquired all this through through my own self ownership, if that makes sense. And I guess if you want to interpret this the next level, you could say, well, maybe this is why I don't really believe in rights, is because what be beyond what does saying certain things are valid from government, okay, so the main reason I push back on rights is because in the Bill of Rights it says here are freedoms from government. So if there is no government, do rights really exist? Well, I think you could argue rights do exist because rights inform what a valid property claim is, right? That's why we have freedoms from government, because those would be invalid property claims by the government when the individual has the valid property claim. I think that's the intellectual form of argument I'd be probably trying to get at, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I think I wasn't quite clear with my language about one point. So when I was talking about that enforcement mechanism, I was contrasting, I guess, what we consider civilized society with what the philosophers call a state of nature. So, Darwin, when Darwin was studying, when he was a naturalist, when he was spending his time, in the Galapagos or in South America, just studying the various animals and plants that there are out there. He began to question his belief in God, because he was like, how could a just God create all of this? I think it was about one of the things that really bugged him was there's some insect that lays its egg inside another insect, and they're when the larva hatch, when the eggs hatch, they bury themselves out of the other insect, instantly killing him. And I bring all this up because in a state of nature, so to speak, there really is I don't see. I guess I don't see. I don't think the rights question really makes sense philosophically. I don't think in a state of nature, meaning meaning a world in which organisms are simply concerned with surviving long enough to pass on their genes. I don't think the rights question makes any sense. I don't think that's how nature works. I don't think that's how the universe is constructed. The universe just is. So that's really my point, is when rights come into question, It has to do with a certain level of consciousness. It has to do with a certain kind of being, which, for most of natural history, has not existed. That might sound very anthropocentric, if that's the correct word. That might sound very human centric, but I don't think it is, because I'm not saying we have rights because we're human. I'm saying we have rights because we exist on a whole other level than an aardvark or a lion or a crocodile. Second point. When it comes to, and this kind of goes back to the broader question of like, what are rights? You can take that apart no matter who you're talking to. So, let's, if I'm talking, I'm talking to you right now, and you are advocating for negative rights, and now you acknowledge that you don't quite like the concept of rights in general, but you, generally speaking, you're arguing for negative rights in a certain fashion. So I can turn around and say, well, look, Matthew, what are rights even? How can you really say that someone has a right to their labor, has a right to own property? How can you say that someone has a right to free association? That's just a bunch of metaphysical gobbledygook. There's no God to give you those rights. Humans are just animals, and animals just act in a certain way in order to survive. So, I can turn the tables and just, we can throw out the concept of rights altogether and say it's all just a bunch of baloney. But, I don't think that rights are a bunch of baloney, but I think that the way you are questioning positive rights is a way you can just question all rights in general. And it really comes down to how, the kind of the way you see what the concept of rights even means.
Well, that raises a few thoughts for me. I mean, I almost want to be lazy and just say that all this really harkens back to is the individualism collectivism debate to some extent, because my instinct when you talked about that and about how a lot of it can be gobbledygook, which I'm not really opposed to, which is kind of why I don't like the language of rights. So I guess my first reaction is one of the reasons why I push back on like people on the left describing these things as rights is because it's really just a really nice way of saying I'm entitled to this thing from society, even though I'm not producing. Right. So even though I'm not able to provide a certain amount of things, I'm still entitled to the other end of that transaction, even though I can't afford it for whatever reason. And it sounds like a way to try to root this in something beyond I can't hold up my end of the consensual bargain, so I'm going to say I'm entitled to it. So I almost don't like the language of rights because it dresses that up in a way that has a positive stigma instead of like a negative stigma. And I'm okay with people framing things to fit their agendas. Like I frame things to fit my agenda. That's fine. I'm not gonna spend all day worrying about that. But in a way, I do kind of believe in the individual because to some extent I romanticize the individual, because the only thing that I can really see having some sort of existential value is knowing that something like fully came from my labor, right? Because everything else is so far away from me. So when we talk about healthcare, if I break my leg, like sure, I want somebody to work on me. But also, that's not something I created. That's not something I put out into the world. So I think it is very hard for me to argue intrinsically that I'm entitled to it, unless I'm just broadly saying people should have this. So I'm saying they're entitled to it. So I'll just let you jump in because I don't want to pontificate. You can get your point in.
Well, no. I guess I just want to I'm asking a clarificatory question. So why are we going to draw the line in the sand and say where value comes from, or where what is most important in life, is knowing that something was a product of your labor. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can philosophically take apart all of this, and just throw it all out the window and say it's all gibberish. But I don't think it's very helpful, because I don't think it gets to the real core of our disagreement. So you can say to me, well, your rights, your positive rights aren't real rights, but I can turn around to you and say, all rights in general are not even real. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm getting at is, I want you to defend why your concept of rights is completely valid and why mine isn't.
So part of the reason why we do this show is that we have completely different intuitions, and the thing that goes along with us having completely different intuitions is, when I defend something, I usually think it's a good point, and then usually you're like, try again. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong on either of our parts. I do have like a really snarky comment that follows that, where I say, but at least when I don't agree with your intuitions, at least I'm not forcing anything on you. So I think I win the tiebreaker. That's why I say to people who I'm friends with that are statists when I get in these arguments. But to some extent, since I'm not a person who, I guess, has like a religious founding that has super deep views of what is true and what has some sort of, I guess, divine validity over other things, I to some extent appeal to my intuitions. And like, when I think of the individual, I am the center of my own consciousness, right? And I perceive everything, even if free will is an illusion, as if I am in control, and I make actions seemingly on my own accord, and everything I do in my life is based around me. And there are actions I can take and there are actions you can take, but in the end, to as much extent as I have control in my own existence, it comes from me, right? So I would say all these reasons make property claims that I do, things that are from my labor, more valid than society, when society is a ton of other people who exist in their consciousness, acting on their own like hypothetical free will. So I would say that's why mine are more valid than theirs, and that's why it's wrong for me to say I'm entitled to somebody else's labor, but I would say I'm definitely entitled to at least the fruits of what I perceive to be my own free will. And saying I'm entitled to other people's things just because I need them seems kind of it seems hard to reconcile. So I guess what I'd say, to some point, I'm willing to cede that it's kind of, it's turtles all the way down, right? To some extent, because we have completely different intuitions. But I would say you're the center of your own consciousness and existence. You're not hopping into other people's bodies. So I would say, at the least, recognizing that, you're most entitled to your own labor and your own gains from that labor. And it's much harder to say that you have a right to things that come from other people way outside of you, that for all you know, like if you're in that desert, you don't even know that there's a society 2,000 miles away because they're so far from you, right? So I think it's hard to say that there's a debt coming from the outside as opposed to all of your control coming from that inside. So that, I think that's why I think it's more grounded.
Okay, so I guess there are kind of two main points that I would like to talk about here. So first point, I think that goes against an earlier point you said. So you were saying just now that ultimately your belief in negative rights just comes from your intuitions. But earlier in the conversation, you said that my view of negative rights, or at least negative rights in general, are universalizable. So I think you can't have it both ways, where you say, well, this is you can't say in one context, well, this is subjective, and in another context, this is objective. And then,
okay, if you want me to answer that, I need to jump in now, because I'll lose my point if you say a second thing on top of that. I guess what I would say is, you might be being too literal. I guess if you want to be charitable, which I mean, but we're both amateur philosophy proteges here. So I guess what I would say is, it's universalizable, just like that experience I explained, where we're all the center of our own consciousness. So if we're the center of our own consciousness, we'll all have our own labor, no matter what society, what year you're in, no matter like what environment you're in. I think that's what's universalizable. In the way that I think everything's based on intuition, the argument about objectivity, right, I could argue is impossible no matter what, because we all could be perceiving consciousness wrong. But I guess what I'm saying, as far as we can feel like we have free will, that is about as universalizable as you can get, is having your own experience in the center of your own consciousness and having your own movements and labor and perception of free will. So I don't think those are in contrast.
That's not, I don't think, though, you can say at that point, just because everybody has this subjective experience of being an individual and of having free will, I don't think it follows logically at that point to say I have the right to my own labor. I just don't see how you can. I'm not saying that you don't have. I'm not even saying that people don't have a right to their own labor, but I don't see. I don't see how those you can go from one to the other. There has to be some other steps along the way that you're reasoning about. But could I really have to jump in here about entitlements. Is that all right?
Well, okay, yeah, that's fine, sure.
You can respond if you want to. I just, at some point, I want to talk about entitlements.
Okay, I guess what I would say is I'm not necessarily saying you're entitled to your own labor. I guess I'm more saying in a broad way, I have more of a right to my own output than I have a right to any other person who I don't experience their choice. I don't get to make decisions from their perspective. I don't get to live from their perspective. But somehow, I think positive rights kind of it muddies things, where things that they're doing in their labor is now something that I have. And this is going to tie into your entitlements. So I guess it's fine that I'm saying this now. So I guess what I'm saying, if it's in my limited consciousness, right, and I make my own choices, I think I have more of a right to my own choices, my own actions, and what I'm willing to input than I do everybody else's. And the fact that somebody could argue that everybody else's is more something I'm obligated to than my own and what I could trade from my own seems kind of like a jump. So even if you don't think it follows that mine is necessarily true, I think it's still closer to the truth than saying all these other people who I don't experience their consciousness, I am somehow have a right to that stuff, though, more so than my own stuff, right?
That's not objective, though.
Well, I'm saying it's closer, though. I mean, you can argue since everything's a perception of free will, and we only have so much understanding, and we have limited senses, then there can't be any objectivity. But I guess I would say that's possible. But based on what we can perceive, this is as close as you can get as your experience in your own eyes and your own life. And since your own choices are most influential at that point, those are the things you should reap the most.
See, and now I'm kind of being like the annoying 3-year-old that's always asking why. But the reason I'm doing that is because I can say that, why do you have more of a right to your own labor than somebody else intrinsically? I can just question that, and I can. That's the problem with the rights, is you can question any of them at any time by just undermining the edifice of the whole concept of rights.
Well, I agree with that. That's why I mentioned how we could have intuitions that are vastly different, and I'll be persuaded by some, and you won't be persuaded by some. And I guess what I would say is, and you keep asking me the same question, and I keep giving the same stock answer. And the reason is because that's a satisfying answer to me, right?
Say then that's objective, though, or it can be universalizable when it's your intuitions, unless you're saying that your intuition, everyone else should have your intuitions.
Well, I guess what I would say is, when I think the subjectivist analysis actually cuts in favor of individualism, because if you have a subjectivist view, then how can you justify forcing things on other people? Because if
someone could believe that, and you couldn't say, so if you believe in subjectivism, you couldn't say that they're wrong because it's all subjective.
Okay, so I guess there's two ways we can proceed in this argument, though.
Hold on. Let me finish. If you don't believe that force is if you believe force is wrong and I believe force is right, then if we acknowledge that it's all based on intuitions, then there's no way that you can say I'm right and you're wrong. Or that
okay, yes, you can, because you just made the assumption that intuitions are equally valid. And okay, so we had this conversation weeks and weeks ago about Jordan Peterson, and I told you this is when you talk about human nature, and I was hearkening on this because I said, okay, but the problem with human nature is a phrase that I just don't like. Is if somebody all of a sudden has the intuition that it's okay for them to murder everybody who they perceive attractiveness wise as under a 6, then I'd be like, that's wrong. But if they had that intuition, I can't tell them that's not their intuition. But their intuition could still be wrong. So I would say you have intuitions and I have intuitions, but I think my intuitions are correct and I think they're more honorable. That's why we bother having this discussion, is because we disagree on intuitions. So if we play the game that all intuitions are equal, then obviously we can't get anywhere. But I'm trying to defend my intuitions, and you're saying, well, it's still an intuition. And like, that's fine, but I'm defending why I think my intuition is better than your intuition.
Well, let me just say one quick thing. Maybe you can say one more reply. Then I really want to get to entitlements, so then we should probably wrap up. Okay. So my issue, or the thing that I'm trying to get across, is I also don't believe all intuitions are created equal. We both agree about that. But the question is, how do we come about, how do we figure out which intuitions are valid and which intuitions are not valid? And I don't think from a subjectivist perspective, you can say that certain tuitions, except in your own, based on your own intuitions, you're going back to the, the very foundation of your worldview. So I can say murder is wrong, and I think murder is wrong, but if we think about it purely from a subjective perspective, I can't say that I can't philosophically say that is wrong all the time, always, because then it's all about the subjective opinions of the individual. Now, if you believe in more objective ways of coming about it, then you can make right or wrong claims about intuitions. But I really want to get to entitlements, so say something really quickly, and then I'll get to entitlements.
So I like that we were able to derail this conversation into a conversation about objectivism versus subjectivism. And the way that you just laid it out satisfied me, because I realized that I don't think you were criticizing my points. You were more saying my points have implications of subjectivism, and subjectivism is like a race to the bottom. And it's almost like you weirdly took out like a hardcore objectivist stance, even though you've kind of like teeter-tottered on those ideas, and we haven't done an episode on it. And it was very odd because like the argument you're making, which I guess is fine, I'm not really prepared to talk about that right now, what was all about the validity of subjectivism. And it wasn't really an argument on, I guess, the contents of what I was saying, besides the fact that it was potentially framed in a subjectivist way. So I'm less offended by that now, because it's almost like we had a mini argument about something we weren't prepared to have, and we were kind of talking past each other while we had it. So I'm fine with that. We'll have that talk in the future, and maybe we'll have to find very specific ways to talk so we don't potentially contradict ourselves or interpret each other as contradicting ourselves. But now that we've finished our objectivism sidebar, you can jump in on entitlements, and then we'll see how that goes. And then we'll wrap up, I guess, eventually, someday, maybe.
Okay, so I'm getting like ramped up. I had to take my mask off. But okay, that's neither here nor there. I disagree with what you said earlier about rights and entitlements. So one more time, I will steelman your argument, make sure I'm getting what you said correct, and then I will respond. Okay. So I think what you're trying to argue goes as follows. Based on your intuitions, which are sort of based on just the inherent individuality of human beings, it's logical to say that, I have, if I, planted some corn, I have more right to that corn than my neighbor who maybe didn't plant any corn, and now, the winter months are coming and he doesn't have any food. I'm not I have more right to that corn than he does because I'm the one that planted and did all the work to get that corn. And of course, I can be charitable and give him some corn if I want to, but that doesn't mean he's entitled to that corn or he has a right to that corn just because he needs that corn to survive. Is that a good way of encapsulating your argument?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I have an issue with people when they bring up this term entitlements, because
That's exactly why I said it.
it's kind of a condescending way to talk about this stuff. It implies basically, from my perspective, that people who claim certain things are rights, such as healthcare or food, are basically freeloaders. That they're trying to get away. They want all the benefits of this society without any of the responsibility, basically. And so they want society to just take care of them, and they don't ever want to have to work a day in their life. And they just know, if a government believes in positive rights, they just know they can, get a UBI check every month or whatever and waste it on Oreos and Call of Duty, and no one's going to stop them. But yeah, I don't think that's a fair characterization of the argument. And wait, can I?
You were trying to steelman me, though. You were trying to steelman me, and I would just note that clearly wasn't my characterization, even though I did use the term. So I just want to clarify. I wasn't implying that. I just used the term. I just want to clarify it. So you can't argue that I was implying that.
Well, I can argue that in the sense that people. Okay, well, maybe this is just a word game, or like maybe I'm just like too focused on that one word. But the idea that healthcare is a human right, I agree with it, not because I want to. I'm trying to think of the best way of phrasing it. Okay, well, tell you what. You tell me how you meant entitlements, and then I will respond. Maybe I didn't understand what you were saying. I want you to tell me what you think entitlement means in that context, and then I will respond.
Okay, imagine I was a person who find myself in 21st century society, and by no fault of my own, I am not very bright, right? I am incapable of a coherent understanding of people who ask more than the basic things from me. And because of this, the best job I can potentially acquire is like $9 an hour lifting boxes at Lowe's. Okay, that's the best I can do in our society. So even if you say I'm working as much as I can, but I still am having trouble I'm having trouble making ends meet, it's like, okay, well, I've done all I could. But I don't think it follows from that I have a right to something that I couldn't possess on my own. Now you could say it'd be great if I could get it, right? Because I'm kind of steelmanning, I guess, your position a little bit, where it's like, imagine the very hard worker, but he's only capable of so much because of the things he's good at. It's like, okay, but does that confer a right to the things he can't afford that could be deemed necessities? And I would say it's not a right, probably because of how I'd get hung up in words about rights. And I would say, well, if you break your leg and in the middle of the desert and there's nobody there to help you, your right to healthcare doesn't mean anything because you have to ask somebody else for it. And it comes from outwards, right? So I think that's probably a good springboard for you.
Yeah, actually, I like just as you began talking, I had that light bulb moment. So I think and it also connects to basically what I just said, which is good. So when I was talking about that characterization, I wasn't trying to straw man you. What I was doing was, maybe again, might have been using words poorly, but when I heard that word entitlements, what I hear that implying, and correct me if you don't mean this, but what I hear that implying is that your rights derive at least at the basic level, from your economic output. So you have, because you have, okay, because you're an individual, and an individual is able to work, is able to labor to get certain things. And what I hear you saying is, or what I hear a lot of people who make this argument saying, is that that is really where the right comes from. It comes from your ability to do something. And, I just don't think, I don't think that's a fair way to govern society. And I don't even think that's not a society worth living in. I mean, that's almost, I hope this doesn't come off in the wrong way, but this kind of sounds like social Darwinism in a sense. And all I'm trying to say is, rights come, they go deeper than an individual's ability to. It goes further than an individual's ability to get something done. So we don't say certain people with physical or intellectual disabilities, we don't say they don't have rights because they're not able to work. No, we say they have the right to, a basic level of living, even though they're not a productive member of society. And that's really where, that's the hill I'm going to die on. It's not about how productive you are, although obviously we want as many people to be productive in society as possible. The rights that I'm talking about go far beyond any individual's level of output.
So I think what you're getting at is kind of why I think scarcity is the other thing that takes away any like real, I think. So when we were talking about like the roots of what I was talking of my argument for negative rights, I'm having a hard time getting the word out. That's God, I have a really bad stutter, so I can't even try to say that word. So let me try to rephrase it so I can avoid that. So the abstract root of positive rights is hard for me to grasp because you have to, if there's scarcity, you're kind of conferring some sort of, I know this is a negative sounding word, but you're conferring some sort of obligation on another person to do something, right? So you have handicapped people, and unfortunately they cannot produce. And it's not their fault, and I'm not trying to call them a burden. But because they cannot produce, somebody has to be able to produce for them. So you're conferring an obligation on some other party to do that to meet the right. That's why I'm saying that this right is to like, I wish I didn't have to use the word abstract, but abstract, because I just can't get the other one out right now, and I apologize. But you have to put this obligation on another party to fulfill it, and that's where I think the difference is most distinct. And that's why people use the word entitlement, despite the connotations, is because you're saying that this person is entitled to this other person's obligation because they exist. And I guess I would say, how is that core to human nature if we can easily imagine, parts where you don't have that other person to fill it in? And it depends on what kind of needs you're talking about. So like if there's no food around you, nobody around you to give you food, then, it's hard to make a case that you should have this right to somebody giving you food because you can't get any right now when there's nobody around you to fulfill that obligation into the right.
Okay, so this actually.
Oh, wait. I have one. Actually, this just came to mind. How can you have a property claim to something that both doesn't exist and there's nobody around to give it to you? I guess that's the other way of putting it. Because I was talking about how to talk about valid property claims from yourself. But if there's nobody around to give you the property, because maybe it doesn't exist, right? The healthcare you need might not even exist yet. So it might as well be the same thing when there's nobody there to give it to you. It's like it doesn't exist because there's nobody there to give you the medicine. So
can you repeat that question? I want to write it down. Can you repeat that question?
So it's, how can a property claim exist if the property is not around you anywhere and there's nobody there to say give you that property? So how can you have a right to food if you're somewhere where there's nobody to give you food and there's no food around you, or you're unable to catch the food because for whatever reason, if it's because you're bad at it or whatnot. But you can, if you're able to do that, if you're able to survive on your own in the situation, then you can confer like this legitimate property right on the things you do, right? So I think maybe that's the way of kind of reconciling that portion of it. Yeah, I just thought that tacked on to whatever the last point I made was.
Okay. We should probably wrap up soon. I get the sense. By the last thing you just said, I almost feel like I guess I shouldn't say that. Never mind. I was going to say something, but it wasn't productive. Okay, so Pete, I want to really hone in on this point about obligations, because this is a very interesting point, and it gets to probably another broader philosophical point we've covered before, and we disagree on most definitely. Because I do think people have obligations to each other. And I think this is going to sound too much like the social contract, and I don't mean to make it sound like that way, but to be okay, I'm really going to sound like a social contract, and I don't want to, but I'm trying to think of a way of rephrasing it so it kind of sidesteps the social contract. Well, let's just take an easy example. So, we would say that if you have a child, okay, there's a mom and a dad, a husband and wife. The wife gives birth to a baby girl. We would say collectively that those parents have an obligation to take care of their child, or if they're unable to, they have an obligation to make sure that their child is taken care of somehow, whether someone whether they give the child to someone who can take care of it, a family member or friend, whether they let an adoption agency take care of the child. But we would say that, generally speaking, parents have obligations to their children. But I would say that like obligations, they go far beyond just like the nuclear family. I have obligations to my classmates. I have obligations to my family. I have obligations to my friends. I have obligations to my fellow citizens. In fact, I have obligations to pretty much everybody that exists at some level. Whether indirectly or directly, I have obligations to most everybody, in the sense that we all live on this pale blue dot, and if I live my life as if I don't have any obligations to anyone else who lives in this pale blue dot, things are just going to become so chaotic and dysfunctional and immoral that people aren't going to be able to have these basic needs that I've been talking about through this entire conversation. So yeah, I do not have a problem with the idea that people have obligations. In fact, I strongly believe that people have obligations to each other, and probably even to themselves.
So we just bumped into the social contract. I appreciate your will to go around it. So since on time we're going so long, I think we should wrap up this episode with a relevant, I guess a thought experiment. So I'll present it to you, and then I'll give you my answer, because I think this will illustrate where we have clearly very different intuitions. And it's even charitable, because you're going to be the one who says the good guy thing, and I'm just going to say the thing that I think is true, even if it makes me sound cold. But I think it illustrates what we think of obligations. So imagine you're graduated from college. You even got your PhD in something, right? You're stretched for cash. You got like $300 in your bank account, rent's due soon, and you're only going to be able to get enough money to cover like 1 month. But you're going to your job interview, and you got like a $7,000 suit on, right? You spent all your money on it, and this is the job interview you're going to nail. You're perfect for it, but you're going to get there just on time, right? And you know that place is so cutthroat that if you're 10 minutes late, you're screwed. And then as you're walking by, obviously you look at the scenic view on your right, and there's a lake, and then there's an unattended child drowning in it. And you're wearing this $7,000 suit, and you have a job interview that is very soon. And if you are late, you will not get that job, and you will be in insurmountable debt and probably screwed if you don't go and get that job. But this kid's going to die unless you jump in there right now. Would it be murder if you kept going to your job interview and ignored the kid who is drowning?
Would it be murder? I guess. Okay, that's actually a very interesting thought experiment. And I'm going to kind of give just a answer off the top of my head. Next episode, maybe I'll think this was an awful answer, and I'll backtrack. But this is what I'll say for the time being. I think that the driver has an obligation to save that child. And I don't even think, again, it's me getting hung up on these words, but like the murder question just doesn't really come up in a sense. I mean, he would be indirectly responsible for the child's death in the sense that he didn't do what he should do to save it. I'm not sure we would go so far as to call that murder. I mean, because technically we tend to think of murder as, either unintentionally killing someone or unintentionally killing someone due to, being careless or something. So, I'm going to sidestep the murder question. I just don't think that I don't think that question really is relevant in that context. But I do think if I were that person, I would expect myself to save the child. And if a friend of mine were in that situation, I would expect my friend to save that child. I'm not even saying, though, I'll just add one more point. I'm not even saying that all obligations you can always meet all obligations. I don't think you can. But I do think we should try. I do think obligations exist, and I do think we should try to meet as many obligations as we can in the moment. And the ones you can't meet, well, you hope that you're in a better position in the future to meet those obligations as well. But I'm not asking everyone to be Superman. I'm not asking everyone to I'm not asking everyone to do everything. I wouldn't even go so far as to say that I'm for effective altruism, even though I was, straw manning it in our conversation the other day. But, that I don't think that undermines my position about obligations, though.
Well, I was pretty much just trying to get you to say, here's an example where you might say that the person is obligated to do it. And I would just say, one could easily argue that you should do it. One could easily argue that if you don't get that job interview, you're really, really screwed and you already have no money. So I don't think you have an obligation because it's a subjective evaluation. So I don't think you have to save the kid. I don't think you're obligated to save the kid, etc. It's an interesting question. I just want to throw it at you. It's kind of fun. It opened up some thoughts, so I think that's good. So yeah, even though we got off topic a lot in this one, I think we at least expressed thoughts that were interesting. Our thoughts interfaced at some level, which means there was some productivity to be had, at least some amount, even if it was potentially negligible. I don't know. I feel like I'll have to listen back to it to know if we even made any ground. But at worst, it may have sharpened, I guess, some ways of framing things that I think might be more valid on my own end, and even on your end if I was going to steel man your position. So I think there was something to be gained here, and I hope you guys found that at worst entertaining, at best insightful. If not, if you weren't watching the video version, you wouldn't have seen both of us borderline on the edge of exploding, waiting to make our point, because we would say something within about 7 seconds that would trigger the other person. But both of us have the habit of monologuing and pontificating for 2 to 3 minutes, so we have to sit there and suffer and want to scream at each other. But we kind of held it together this one. So if you guys enjoyed this, yeah, you can find all of the backlog in on any podcatcher or on YouTube by searching Beyond Talking Points and The Anti-Philosopher if you want to see our faces as we argue and wait till we get to yell our counter arguments and so forth. And I almost wanted to apologize for any long, but I don't know. I think we made progress and I thought it was worth it. So signing off, it's Mad Matt.